So Prince William has just begun quietly stripping Camilla of influence inside the royal machine after those yacht photos exposed a private trip that raised serious questions about who she was meeting and why the journey was never properly disclosed. And the shocking part isn't simply that Camilla was on a luxury yacht. It's what William allegedly found when his team followed the paperwork an earlier trip, financial connections, and a trail of palace decisions that suddenly made the whole thing look much bigger than one private holiday. Before we get into all of it, make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss what happens next, because this story gets considerably more complicated. All right, let's start where this actually begins. The yacht itself was only the trigger. The real problem was the relationship behind it, the people involved, and the fact that William had already been pushing for much tighter rules around private hospitality and outside influence. And according to the story, Camilla's office already knew those rules existed. So why did she go anyway? And more importantly, why did someone inside that circle decide William needed to know about it before the public did? And here's the part that actually gets crazy. The yacht was never really the biggest problem. The bigger problem was what Prince William allegedly discovered after photographs from Camilla's private trip began circulating a paper trail that appeared to connect the journey to people with serious business interests around the royal institution. And suddenly, what looked like an embarrassing holiday became something much harder for the palace to explain. The trip itself was private. Camilla was reportedly aboard a luxury yacht off the southern coast of France, surrounded by wealthy guests whose businesses allegedly touched property, media, lobbying, and heritage interests. Now, to be fair, none of that automatically proves wrongdoing. And honestly, that's what makes this story more complicated. The issue isn't simply that Camilla was enjoying a luxury yacht. Royals can take private trips, they can have wealthy friends, they can spend time away from official duties. The question is, who was paying, who was involved, and whether everything that should have been disclosed was actually disclosed. Because the yacht wasn't sitting there completely invisible, a routine maritime registry update placed the vessel at a specific marina around the time Camilla was allegedly there. Then, a photograph surfaced showing guests aboard the boat. That photograph reportedly disappeared quickly, but by then, someone had already saved it. And this is where the whole thing started moving. The image was allegedly compared with the registry information, and suddenly journalists had something they could investigate. They could identify the vessel, they could examine its ownership structure, they could start asking who else had been there. And the deeper they went, the less this looked like an ordinary private holiday. The yacht was reportedly connected to a complicated ownership structure involving companies outside Britain. One of the people connected to that network allegedly had business interests in areas where royal patronages and institutional influence could matter. Think about what that means. Even if nobody asked Camilla for a favor, even if nobody discussed business at dinner, the appearance of private access can become a problem all by itself. That's especially important because William had reportedly been pushing for tighter rules around hospitality and outside relationships. So this wasn't happening in a vacuum. There were already concerns inside the palace about how senior royals handled wealthy contacts. And now Camilla was allegedly sitting on a yacht surrounded by precisely the kind of people those new rules were designed to scrutinize. But here's the detail that changes the entire story. William apparently didn't first learn about the trip from the newspapers. Someone close to that circle allegedly made sure the information reached him directly, and that raises a completely different question. Who knew enough about what happened on that yacht to warn the future king? Because if someone inside the circle deliberately handed William the information, then this wasn't just a scandal waiting to break. It was a warning. And what William did with that warning is where this story really begins. Now here's what makes this even more significant. If this had simply been Camilla taking a private holiday, there probably wouldn't be much of a story at all. Royals travel privately all the time. The problem begins when private hospitality involves people whose business interests may overlap with the institution those royals represent. And that distinction is everything, because the palace has rules for a reason. When a senior royal receives expensive travel, accommodation, gifts, or hospitality from an outside individual, the relationship is supposed to be properly recorded and reviewed. That doesn't automatically mean something improper happened. It means the institution needs to know who is providing the hospitality and whether that person has something to gain from being close to a royal. Think about it like this. If a wealthy businessman invites an ordinary friend onto his yacht, that's his business. If that businessman has interests involving property, heritage projects, political lobbying, or companies connected to royal charities, and the guest happens to be the queen consort, suddenly, the same invitation carries a completely different level of risk. And William understood that. According to the story, his team had already been pushing for tighter controls on outside relationships involving senior royals. The basic idea was simple: fewer private arrangements, clearer declarations, and absolutely no situation where somebody could buy access to the royal circle and then claim it was simply friendship. That policy mattered because the monarchy had already seen what happens when access becomes impossible to separate from influence. So imagine William's reaction when he allegedly discovered that Camilla had taken this trip despite those rules being in place. And here's the uncomfortable part. Camilla's office was reportedly aware of the new guidance. This wasn't supposedly a case of somebody forgetting that the rules existed. The rules were already there. That changes the question completely. Now you're asking whether Camilla misunderstood the rules, ignored them, or believed the trip was private enough that they simply didn't apply. And honestly, that distinction could determine everything that happens next. Then the financial trail made the situation even harder to dismiss. The yacht was reportedly connected to a Luxembourg-based holding structure, while people around its ownership network had interests extending into property and lobbying. Again, none of that proves criminal conduct, but it creates exactly the kind of appearance problem the palace was supposedly trying to eliminate. And then there was the alleged donation. A company connected to the same network had reportedly contributed money to a royal-related structure while also having interests connected to a heritage property issue. Now, ask yourself this. Would the public look at that relationship and see a completely ordinary friendship? Probably not. And that's why the yacht suddenly became much more than a photograph. It became a test of whether the monarchy's new rules actually meant anything when they involved someone as protected and politically sensitive as Camilla. Because if the rules only apply to less powerful people, then they aren't really rules. They're suggestions. And William apparently wasn't prepared to let that happen. But there was one detail his team found that made the whole situation much worse. The yacht trip wasn't the first time Camilla had allegedly accepted this kind of hospitality, and that earlier trip had already been noticed inside the palace. That is where this stops looking like one questionable decision and starts looking like a pattern. But to truly understand why William could look at this situation and refuse to simply let it disappear, you have to go back, because this reaction didn't begin with a yacht. It began years ago, when William learned that the most damaging problems inside the royal family are rarely caused by one decision. They grow when people stay quiet, when uncomfortable questions are avoided, and when personal relationships become more important than clear rules. And that lesson became painfully personal for him. Most people remember Diana's death. What gets forgotten is what William experienced as a teenager watching the institution around his family struggle with the consequences of everything that had happened before it. He saw the public fallout. He saw the pressure on his father. He saw the way private decisions became public disasters. And Camilla was always part of that history. That doesn't mean William spent his adult life waiting for revenge. It means he grew into a man who became extremely focused on control, boundaries, and documentation. And honestly, you can see that in the way he has approached his own responsibilities. When William took control of the Duchy of Cornwall, he inherited a massive organization with property, investments, contracts, employees, and outside relationships. His approach was reportedly straightforward. Put things in writing. Know who is being paid. Know who is making decisions. And don't rely on personal trust when an institution needs proper safeguards. That matters because the yacht story allegedly involved almost the exact opposite: private hospitality, informal relationships, people connected to business interests, and questions about whether everything had been properly recorded. Now here's where another person enters the story. According to the supplied account, a senior palace official had noticed Camilla's earlier yacht trip and raised the issue privately at the time. But nothing formal followed. No major review, no public disclosure, no lasting institutional action. The matter simply went quiet, and William apparently didn't know about it. Think about what that means. If the earlier concern had been properly escalated, the later yacht trip might have looked completely different. There would have been a record. There would have been a warning. There might have been restrictions. Instead, the issue allegedly disappeared into the machinery of the palace. And that's the part William would have found difficult to ignore. Because, from his perspective, this wasn't just about Camilla accepting hospitality. It was about the system protecting itself from uncomfortable questions. And that brings us back to Diana. William's entire adult approach to the monarchy has been shaped by the belief that institutions need to protect people before problems become disasters. You don't wait until something explodes. You build rules that stop the explosion from happening. So when William's team allegedly discovered that an earlier warning had been buried, the emotional calculation changed. He wasn't simply looking at what Camilla had done. He was looking at what everyone around her had allowed to happen. And here's the detail that makes this personal. William had spent years trying to build a monarchy where informal protection could no longer override institutional responsibility. Now he was looking directly at a situation where personal loyalty may have done exactly that. The past had suddenly collided with the present, and William was holding the evidence. But there was still one question he couldn't answer. Who exactly had decided that the earlier warning didn't need to go any further? Because finding that person would reveal whether this was really Camilla's mistake or something much bigger inside the palace. And this is the detail that makes the whole thing much harder to dismiss. The yacht was only the visible part. Behind it was a network of people, money, business interests, and palace relationships that William's team allegedly began examining once the original photographs were connected to the vessel. And honestly, this is where the story stops being about a holiday. The first person to look at was the yacht's owner. He was not some random billionaire with nothing to do with Britain. His business interests reportedly included property, agricultural policy, and heritage-related investments. Again, none of that proves criminal conduct, but ask yourself what happens when someone with those interests gets unusually close to a senior royal. That is where the risk begins. Then there were the other guests. One allegedly had property planning interests in Britain. Another was connected to a media company with commercial relationships involving businesses that had received royal support. There were also people whose names had reportedly appeared in European lobbying investigations. None of them needed to ask Camilla for anything directly. That's the important point. Influence doesn't always look like somebody walking into a room and saying, "Can you help me?" Sometimes it looks like access. A private dinner, a long conversation, an introduction, a relationship that becomes useful months or years later. And that's precisely why royal hospitality rules exist. The strategy behind this network was actually pretty clever if you look at it from the perspective of the people involved. Nothing had to be formal. Nobody needed to sign anything. Everyone could maintain plausible distance. Camilla could say it was a private trip. The businessman could say he was hosting friends. The palace could say it had nothing to do with official business. And yet everyone still gained something from proximity. That's what made the arrangement so difficult to challenge. But then William's team allegedly found another connection. A company associated with the Yacht's ownership network had reportedly made a substantial donation to a royal-related organization. Around the same period, another company connected to that network was involved in a heritage property application. That application was ultimately unsuccessful, but the overlap was enough to raise questions about whether the relationship should ever have been allowed to remain informal. And here's where Camilla's position became especially uncomfortable. There was reportedly a meeting between one of the yacht guests and someone connected to her patronage network before the later trip. Camilla allegedly said she had not known about the meeting. That could be completely true, but if it was true, it created another problem. Why were people inside her own circle meeting someone from the yacht network without properly informing her? And if she did know, then the explanation becomes even harder. Either way, something inside the system wasn't working. This is where the host has to be fair. There is no evidence in the supplied story that Camilla personally instructed anyone to influence a planning decision. There is no proof that a favor was exchanged. There is no claim that the yacht owner committed a crime. The issue is the pattern: private hospitality, business interests, a previous trip, a donation, an unlogged meeting, and palace staff who allegedly knew pieces of the story but didn't connect them. Put all of that together, and suddenly the yacht looks less like a harmless luxury escape and more like a governance problem waiting to explode. And Camilla's team was only one step away from explaining it all away. Then, William's investigators found the document that made that almost impossible. Because the next piece of evidence didn't just show what happened, it showed what the palace already knew. Okay, so here's the part that actually changes everything. William's team didn't just have photographs of Camilla on a yacht. They had a paper trail. And once those documents were placed together, the story allegedly looked very different from the simple explanation that this was nothing more than a private holiday. The folder reportedly contained the yacht registry information, financial records, details surrounding the earlier trip, lobbying disclosures, and information about the meeting involving someone connected to Camilla's patronage network. But the most important document was the one concerning the earlier trip, because someone inside the palace had apparently known about it, and that changes the entire story. Until this point, you could argue that Camilla had simply made a questionable decision. Maybe she thought the trip was private. Maybe she didn't realize the hospitality needed to be disclosed. Maybe nobody around her understood how closely the yacht owner was connected to outside business interests. Those explanations were still possible, but if the palace had already noticed a similar situation before, then William was no longer dealing with an isolated mistake. He was dealing with a pattern. And honestly, that's the detail that would make any serious institutional review much more difficult to stop. William reportedly wanted to know who had first been told about the earlier trip, who had raised the concern, who had received that concern, and most importantly, who decided it didn't need to go any further. The answers were apparently unclear. A senior official knew the earlier trip had been flagged, but couldn't explain exactly who had made the decision to leave it off the formal record. Think about how damaging that is. The problem isn't simply that something wasn't disclosed. The problem is that someone may have had the opportunity to deal with it and chose not to. Then came the question of Charles. According to the supplied account, Charles knew Camilla had taken the later trip, but only in the most general sense. He allegedly knew where she was going and roughly when she would return. What he supposedly did not know was the full ownership structure behind the yacht, the business connections, the earlier trip, or the financial relationship. And that placed Charles in an incredibly difficult position, because now he had to decide whether to defend his wife based on what she told him or support William's demand for a formal review based on documents. This is where the story stops being a fight between William and Camilla. It becomes a fight over what the monarchy itself is supposed to protect: personal loyalty or institutional rules. William reportedly chose the second. He presented the evidence to senior advisors and demanded answers. No shouting, no public accusation, just documents on a table and questions that couldn't easily be avoided. And here's what makes the moment so important. William now had information that Camilla's office couldn't simply explain away as gossip. The documents existed. The earlier warning existed. The financial connections existed. And the unanswered questions existed. But having the evidence was only half the battle. William still had to decide how far he was prepared to go against his father's wife. And that decision was about to force Charles into a choice he had spent years trying to avoid. And this is where William stopped investigating and started acting. He didn't give an interview. He didn't make a dramatic announcement. He didn't publicly accuse Camilla of anything. Instead, according to the story, he turned the information into a formal institutional response. William demanded a full written disclosure covering both yacht trips. He wanted the palace to establish exactly who had arranged the hospitality, who had paid for it, who had known about it, and why the earlier concern had never been properly recorded. Then he demanded a review of Camilla's patronages. The purpose was straightforward. Find out whether any organizations connected to her public work had relationships with the people involved in the yacht network. And finally, he wanted contact between Camilla's household and the yacht owner suspended while the review continued. Now, some of you are probably asking whether William could really push something like this through. And that's where the power structure matters. William wasn't acting like a son complaining about his father's wife. He was acting as the future king responsible for protecting the institution he would eventually inherit. That distinction gave his move enormous weight. But Charles wasn't immediately comfortable with it. According to the supplied account, Charles argued that Camilla had never intended to deceive anyone, and that a formal review could make an already difficult situation much worse. And honestly, you can understand why he would think that. Charles has spent decades defending his relationship with Camilla. He knows exactly how damaging another public conflict around her could become. But William's response was reportedly blunt. The story was already out. Trying to bury it wouldn't make it disappear. It would only make the palace look as though it had something to hide. And that left Charles with a problem he couldn't easily solve. If he stopped William, he would be undermining the very transparency reforms the monarchy was supposed to follow. If he supported William, he would effectively allow an investigation into his own wife's conduct. So Charles asked for time. William gave him a short window. During that period, Camilla spoke with her advisors spoke with palace officials, and the lawyers began looking at the disputed details. But the documents didn't disappear, and the earlier warning didn't disappear either. Eventually, Charles reportedly accepted that the review would proceed. He asked William to make sure Camilla was treated fairly. William agreed, but he would not agree to stop the investigation. And that's the moment the power balance changed. Because once a formal review begins, personal relationships become much less important. Everything becomes a record. Everything can be checked. Every explanation can be compared against another document. And suddenly, the question isn't whether Charles trusts Camilla, it's whether the paperwork supports what she says happened. That's a very different battlefield. William had chosen it deliberately, and the move was already irreversible. But here's the part Camilla probably didn't expect. William didn't need to remove her himself. He only needed to change the machinery around her. And the first visible sign of that change was about to appear in public, where nobody could pretend they hadn't noticed it. And then came the moment that made the entire power shift visible without anyone actually saying a word. There was no palace announcement, no dramatic statement from William, no confrontation in front of cameras. Instead, it happened during a public appearance where almost everything looked completely normal. Camilla was simply missing. At first glance, that sounds meaningless. Royals change schedules all the time. Engagements are moved, appearances are canceled, people get sick, plans change. But this wasn't just any appearance. Camilla had originally been expected to attend the London film premiere alongside Charles. Her name had been included in the original plans, and her absence was officially explained as a scheduling issue. Charles arrived alone. And here's what makes this even more significant. Around the same period, several of Camilla's previously assigned engagements were quietly being handed to Catherine. No announcement explained the change. Nobody stood up and said, "Camilla has been removed." They didn't need to. The diary was saying it for them. Think about how the monarchy actually communicates. Most of the important decisions aren't announced with dramatic speeches. They appear through who gets invited, who gets briefed, who stands beside whom, and who suddenly isn't there anymore. And Catherine stepping into those spaces mattered. She wasn't simply filling empty dates. She was taking over events that had originally belonged to Camilla's public role. Her office confirmed several appearances quickly, making the transition look completely ordinary. That was the clever part. Nothing looked dramatic enough to become a scandal by itself. But put everything together, and the picture became impossible to ignore. Camilla had fewer engagements. Her team was smaller. Her access to internal information had been reduced, and Catherine was increasingly appearing in the spaces Camilla had previously occupied. Now ask yourself this. If William really wanted to humiliate Camilla, wouldn't he have done it publicly? Instead, everything happened quietly. That tells you something about his strategy. He wasn't trying to create a spectacle. He was changing the structure around her. And honestly, that's much more powerful, because a public argument gives the other person something to fight. A shrinking role is different. What exactly do you fight when nobody has officially removed you? What do you say when your title remains untouched, but the meetings disappear? What do you challenge when the invitations simply stop arriving? That's the uncomfortable genius of this kind of institutional power. Camilla could still stand beside Charles. She could still appear at major ceremonies. She could still be called Queen, but the machinery underneath that title was beginning to change, and the public was starting to notice. One photograph showed Charles arriving alone. Several diary changes showed Catherine taking over, and inside the palace, staff were watching the same pattern develop from much closer range. The message was becoming obvious. Camilla's position had not been destroyed overnight. It was being quietly reduced, and that detail changes everything, because the next question isn't whether William had acted. He clearly had. The real question is what happened when Camilla finally realized just how much control she had already lost. And this is where Camilla's side finally had to react. For weeks, the changes had been quiet enough to explain away. A diary adjustment here, a reassigned engagement there, a staff role being restructured. But once enough pieces moved, pretending nothing had happened became impossible. Camilla's team went into damage control. The first response was simple. Her advisors pushed the idea that the changes were nothing more than routine palace planning. They wanted people to believe that Camilla remained fully supported by Charles and that there was no wider disagreement inside the royal household. And honestly, that strategy made sense. If you admit there's a power struggle, you've already admitted there's a power struggle. So the safest option was to make everything sound boring. But here's where it fell apart. The public could see the pattern. Camilla's schedule was getting thinner. Catherine was appearing at more of the events that Camilla had once handled. Several members of Camilla's team had moved elsewhere, while her access to internal briefings became more restricted. None of those things proved a dramatic royal feud on their own. Together, they told a very different story. And then came the detail that made the situation even harder to contain. The yacht owner had become part of the conversation again. Questions about the private trip, the undisclosed hospitality, and the financial connections surrounding the vessel were not disappearing. They were getting harder to avoid. Camilla's advisors reportedly wanted the issue treated as a private matter. But William's position was completely different. For him, this wasn't about whether Camilla personally believed she had done anything wrong. It was about whether the institution could afford to look as though access to a senior royal could be mixed with private business interests. That's a much harder argument to defeat. And here's the part that actually gets crazy. Charles was caught right in the middle. He had every personal reason to protect his wife. But William was no longer approaching the issue as a family disagreement. He was treating it as a question of institutional rules. That distinction changed everything. Charles could defend Camilla emotionally. William could point to documents, schedules, financial records, and palace procedures, and when those two arguments collided, the emotional one suddenly looked much weaker. The damage control effort also created another problem. Every explanation raised another question. If the trip was completely innocent, why had it never appeared properly in the relevant records? If the hospitality was routine, why was the relationship with the yacht owner becoming such a sensitive subject? And if Camilla's role was completely secure, why were her responsibilities being quietly redistributed? The palace could answer each question separately. It was the pattern they couldn't explain away. Then came the clearest sign that the old protection around Camilla was no longer working. Charles did not reverse the changes. He did not restore the diary. He did not bring back the staff. And he did not force William to stop the review. That silence mattered, because Camilla had spent decades building her position around one central fact: Charles would stand beside her. Now, for the first time, that protection had limits. And once those limits became visible, the people around her had to start thinking about their own futures. Staff who had depended on Camilla's influence suddenly had to decide where they stood. Advisors had to consider whether defending her was worth risking their own positions. And the palace itself began quietly reorganizing around William's authority. The collapse wasn't loud. It was administrative, and that's exactly why it was so difficult to stop. But there was still one thing Camilla had left. She could fight back, and if she chose to do that, the private dispute would become something far more dangerous, a direct confrontation between the king's wife and his heir. And then William made the move that left Camilla with almost nothing left to argue about. There was no press conference, no public accusation, no dramatic announcement from Buckingham Palace. Instead, The final decision appeared through something much quieter: the royal diary. Camilla's remaining engagements were reviewed, and several of the most significant ones were reassigned to other members of the family. That might sound administrative. It wasn't, because by this point, everyone understood what the diary represented. It showed who the institution trusted to carry its public image. And William was making that choice very clear. Catherine was taking on more of the major appearances. Anne remained a reliable senior figure. William himself was becoming increasingly central to decisions that once would have been handled through Charles and his household. Camilla still had the title, but the machinery around the title was changing. And here's the part that really matters. William didn't need to remove her formally. He had already achieved something more practical. He had made sure that her influence no longer depended on controlling the rooms where decisions were made. The staff changes remained. The restricted briefings remained. The reassigned engagements remained. And the review surrounding the yacht controversy continued without being quietly buried. That was the real, final action. The issue was no longer whether Camilla could return to exactly the position she had occupied before. That door was effectively closed. And honestly, this is where the whole story comes full circle. Camilla had spent decades becoming accepted inside an institution that once seemed determined to keep her at its edges. She eventually became queen consort. She built relationships with charities, advisors, royal staff, and members of the wider establishment. But William approached the situation from a completely different direction. He wasn't asking whether Camilla deserved her title. He was asking whether the system around that title was still operating according to the rules he believed the monarchy needed. And once he reached his answer, he acted. Quietly, methodically. Without giving Camilla a dramatic moment she could turn into a public battle. That may be the most important detail of all. Because if William had publicly attacked her, Camilla could have defended herself. She could have appealed to Charles. She could have presented herself as the victim of a family feud. Instead, William kept the argument focused on governance. Documents, disclosure, access, responsibilities. And that left very little room for emotional counterattack. The final confirmation came through the simplest thing imaginable. The next major royal schedule was published, and the roles had already changed. No explanation, no special announcement, just different names attached to different responsibilities. And that was it. The power structure had moved. Camilla was still visible, but she was no longer at the center of the machine in the same way. William had effectively drawn a line between the monarchy he inherited and the monarchy he intends to build. A smaller institution, tighter control, less tolerance for private relationships that create even the appearance of a conflict. And whatever anyone thinks of that strategy, one thing is difficult to deny. It worked. The question now is what happens when Charles is no longer there to stand between William and Camilla, because that's when this quiet power struggle could become something much bigger. When you step back and look at the entire chain of events, what you actually see is something much bigger than a yacht scandal. This wasn't really about a holiday. It wasn't even just about Camilla. It was about who controls the institution when personal loyalty and institutional rules finally collide. And that is where William's position becomes so interesting. He didn't publicly attack Camilla. He didn't try to destroy her reputation. He didn't demand that Charles denounce his wife. Instead, he changed the machinery around her. The diary changed. The staffing changed. The information flow changed. And suddenly, a woman who had spent decades building influence inside the royal family was operating with far less of it. That's not a family disagreement. That's a power move. And honestly, you can disagree completely with William's approach, and still understand why it matters. Because the monarchy survives on trust, the public has to believe that access to senior royals isn't something that can simply be bought through private hospitality, personal friendships, or business connections. If that trust disappears, the institution has a much bigger problem than one embarrassing photograph. And this is where William's personal history matters. He grew up watching private decisions become public disasters. He watched his parents' marriage collapse under extraordinary pressure. He watched his mother become trapped inside a system that often seemed more interested in protecting the institution than protecting the people inside it. Then he watched Diana die, while the entire world debated what had gone wrong. You cannot tell me those experiences have nothing to do with the way William approaches power today. He has spent years building a different kind of system around himself. More documentation, more control, fewer informal arrangements, fewer people who can operate outside the rules. So when the yacht controversy landed in front of him, he wasn't simply seeing Camilla. He was seeing a type of institutional weakness he has spent his adult life trying to eliminate. And that makes the story far more personal than it first appeared. Camilla, meanwhile, faces a completely different reality. She achieved something that once seemed almost impossible. She went from being deeply unpopular to becoming queen consort. She built public acceptance through patience, routine, and years of service. But titles don't automatically create power. People create power. Access creates power. Information creates power. And once those things begin disappearing, the title alone cannot restore them. That may be the hardest lesson in this entire story. Charles still loves Camilla. That has never really been the central question. The question is whether his ability to protect her can survive the changing balance of power inside the monarchy. And William has already shown that he is willing to make decisions his father finds potential. So when Charles eventually leaves the throne, the situation becomes even clearer. William won't inherit a system built around protecting Camilla. He will inherit an institution he believes he has a responsibility to protect from itself. And that is why this story matters. The yacht was only the trigger. The real story was William deciding that personal relationships could no longer come before the rules he wants the monarchy to live by. Whether you think he was right or wrong, the direction is unmistakable. The old system depended on personal loyalty. William's system depends on control. And the boy who once watched his family fall apart is now powerful enough to decide what happens next. This time, he isn't reacting. He's choosing.